This is the U.S. Report with James Morrow.
Good evening and welcome to the show. Coming up tonight, a judge in Georgia drops some of the criminal charges against Donald Trump in his election interference case. But is the former president out of the woods? Plus, a bill to ban TikTok passes the U.S. House of Reps. Is this the start of a new pushback against China? Plus, Biden and Trump secure their party nominations, setting the stage for an election rematch this year officially. But first, important news out of Washington that I don't think has gotten anywhere near enough attention. Remember Robert Hur? He's the special counsel who investigated Joe Biden over his handling, or rather mishandling, of classified documents and concluded that there was no point in prosecuting the president because Joe Biden presented as, quote, an elderly man with a poor memory. Now, that report was something of a bombshell. It led to that train wreck of a press conference when Joe Biden insisted that he was mentally fit, and then went on to confuse Egypt with Mexico. Well, the transcript of Robert Hur's interview with the president has dropped and is not pretty. Nor were some of the things Hur revealed to Congress when he testified this week. Among other things, Hur revealed that the White House tried to get him to change his report before it went public.
Did the White House then, once they got the report before it went public, did the White House try to weigh in with your investigation on elements of that report and, frankly, get the report changed?
They did request certain edits and changes to the draft report.
And Hur went the full Maury Povich, revealing other lies of the president.
February 8th, the White House question, Mr. President, why did you share classified information with your ghostwriter? The president, I did not share classified information. I did not share it. I guarantee I did not. That's not true, is it, Mr. Hur?
That is inconsistent with the findings based on the evidence in my report.
Yes, it's a lie, is just what regular people would say, right? Yeah, all right. So the next one. And all the stuff that was in my home was in filing cabinets that were either locked or able to be locked. That wasn't true either, was it?
That was inconsistent with the findings of our investigation.
Another lie, people might say.
Hur also said that Biden had classified documents lying all over the joint.
Mr. Hur, classified documents were found at the Penn Biden Center?
That's correct.
They were found in President Biden's garage?
In Wilmington, Delaware, yes.
And in his basement den?
Also in the same home, yes.
In his main floor office?
Correct.
And his third floor den?
Correct.
At the University of Delaware?
Correct.
And at the Biden Institute?
Correct.
As indeed this photo of classified Afghanistan documents in Joe Biden's basement further proves. Hur was also explicit on this point. Contrary to what Democrats have claimed, Hur's report did not exonerate Biden. And remember, the special counsel found that Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials, again, in his home, garage, and office for decades. Hur shut down the Democrats' claim in this testy exchange with committee member Pramila Jayapal.
So this lengthy, expensive, and independent investigation resulted in a complete exoneration of President Joe Biden. For every document you discussed in your report, you found insufficient evidence that the president violated any laws about possession or retention of classified materials.
I need to go back and make sure that I take note of the word that you used, exoneration. That is not a word that
I'm
appears
going
in
to
the
continue
report,
with my questions.
I'm
going to continue with my questions. I know that the term
I ultimately reached
I know that
whether
the term
sufficient evidence existed such that the likely outcome
you exonerated
would be a conviction.
I know
I
that
did
the
not
term
exonerate him.
willful.
Committee Chair Jim Jordan summed it up.
Mr. Hur produced a 345-page report, but in the end, it boils down to a few key facts. Joe Biden kept classified information. Joe Biden failed to properly secure classified information. And Joe Biden shared classified information with people he wasn't supposed to. Joe Biden broke the law. But because he's a forgetful old man who would appear sympathetic to a jury, Mr. Hur chose not to bring charges.
Now, there's a lot more to this, too. The transcript of Hur's interview with Biden was very telling. Among the things the transcript reveals, Biden said, quote, "When did I announce for president?" He also said, "If it was in 2013, when did I stop being vice president?" Biden asked, "In 2009, am I still vice president?" And he said, "Trump gets elected in November of 2017? Okay, and contrary to Biden's claim that it was her who brought up his son Beau's death, in fact, the transcript reveals it was Joe Biden himself who brought it up. Which brings us back full circle to the question of Joe Biden's memory and his mental faculties, which Hur said were, in his words, quote, "front and center in the investigation."
The evidence and the president himself put his memory squarely at issue. We interviewed the president and asked him about his recorded statement. Quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote. He told us that he didn't remember saying that to his ghostwriter. He also said he didn't remember finding any classified material in his home after his vice presidency. And he didn't remember anything about how classified documents about Afghanistan made their way into his garage. My assessment in the report about the relevance of the president's memory was necessary and accurate and fair.
Those with better memories than the president will recall that when Donald Trump was president, every single slip he made was used by his opponents to suggest the 25th Amendment should be invoked to remove him from the White House because he had lost the mental or physical capacity for the job. As if. But the evidence presented by Robert Hur about Joe Biden is far more damning because it creates the following dilemma. Either, indeed, Joe Biden is mentally impaired and his family and medical advisors should urge him to resign, or, as his supporters say, he is mentally competent, which means that according to the damning findings of the Hur report, he is also guilty. Well, joining me now is the Australian newspaper's Washington correspondent, Adam Creighton. Adam, big news out of Georgia this week. The judge in Donald Trump's election interference trial has dismissed 3 of the criminal counts against the former U.S. president. Tell us what these charges were about, and is there a chance more charges in this case are going to fall by the wayside?
Well, just on the first question, I think it was a surprise that some of these somewhat obscure and vague charges were dropped. This, of course, is the racketeering case, the case largely against Donald Trump, and of course, I think some 18 so-called co-conspirators who allegedly tried to get the Georgia government to overturn the vote in 2020 in that state. Many legal analysts, of course, have different views, but I think the objectively fair view that this is a rather trumped-up case, if you like, and it's basically trying to get Trump. It was a shock that some of the charges were dropped. I'm starting to think that maybe the judge, Scott McAfee, who made this decision, I think he may have done this perhaps to butter up the Trump side of the equation, because, of course, in coming days, as we know, he's got to make the much more important decision on whether to dump Fani Willis, who is the district prosecutor for that case. And it may well be that if he does dump her, which I think is unlikely, but if he does, the whole case may fall apart. So, I mean, all of the charges would be dropped then, because it may well be that no other district attorney in the state of Georgia wants to take up what is, of course, an extremely controversial case.
Yeah, and this is the issue with Fani Willis and the prosecutor who was also her secret boyfriend that she was paying state money to run the case. And it all, this creates a big sort of idea that there's a lot of political interference in this, as there is in New York, where the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has now said that they're willing to delay Trump's hush money trial for another 30 days, according to a court filing. Now, this hush money case that was scheduled to start on March 25th, pushing this back, does this have implications for the November election?
Well, look, it probably does, in the sense that, I mean, you have to laugh a bit. I mean, in the space of 3 months, it seems most of the serious cases against Donald Trump, and of course there's the 4 indictments, and the hush money case is one of those indictments, but they're all being pushed constantly being pushed into the future. It seems more and more likely that most of them are going to be after the 2024 election. I mean, this one, of course, won't be, but it's just amusing that that even that, which of course was meant to be set in stone, but, for the 25th of March, is even going to be pushed forward by 30 days. And of course, it's worth pointing out too that that particular case, which is the only one of the four that is scheduled so far, is the case that I would say is the most politically helpful to Donald Trump of all. That was the first indictment, I believe, that was issued last year, and of course, after it was issued, his polling soared. So I mean, he's probably not too, so he'd be pleased with the delay, of course. But I mean, if any of the four cases gets to go ahead, I think he'd want it to be this one.
Yeah, indeed. Now, I want to move on then now to Trump's position in the election here, because one of the big issues here that we're seeing play out is always, of course, the economy. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Inflation is still apparently a killer for a lot of Americans. New data released this week showed inflation edging up again to 3.2% in February. Yet here's what Joe Biden had to say.
Wages are rising faster than prices, and now we have among the lowest inflation rates of any country in America, and we're still fighting to lower it even further.
The lowest inflation rate of any country in America. Adam, this is putting aside the president's word salad there, this would suggest that there's a big issue politically for the president if he cannot say that prices are coming down for Americans.
Yes. Yeah, well, it certainly is. And, of course, there's no chance that he'll ever be able to say that prices are actually coming down. I mean, inflation is still very much positive. It's 3.2%, as you said, over the year to February. And a few years ago, that would have been considered a massive rate of inflation. I mean, it's not low, 3.2% every year. I mean, if you add that up over 5 years, that's an enormous amount of inflation. So, so ordinary Americans are feeling it. And, I noticed there the president said that wages are rising faster than inflation. Well, maybe for some people, but certainly not for most people. I think he's wrong there with the statistics. And it's probably the case that the people who are getting... Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, because I thought there was a really interesting little cultural marker about this here. The New York Times, which of course is read by, a higher income elite group of people in America, they published this week a collection of 100 cheap dinners for inflation-heavy times. That's how they build it. So clearly this would be something that's affecting people, at all ends of the economic spectrum now in America.
Yes, but I mean, it certainly affects the poorer people the most, obviously, because they're far more attuned to the cost of things at the supermarket, than wealthy people, than the sorts of people that read the New York Times, and even civil servants. Anyone who works for the federal or state government tends to get an indexation in their pay, which is linked to inflation. So, so the people that really suffer are the low-income workers in the private sector who don't get indexation, and for whom inflation just makes them poorer and poorer. And also those people, they tend to have savings in the bank in the form of bank deposits. And of course, every time inflation goes up, the value of those deposits declines. So, I mean, inflation really is an insidious beast for, for a very large share of the US population.
And is this cutting the chances that Janet Yellen and the Fed are going to cut rates later this year, as people had been kind of talking up as something that might give the economy a boost heading into the election?
Yeah, look, probably it does. It does at the margin make it less likely. I mean, the Fed is fairly determined to get the inflation rate back to 2%. I mean, my kind of personal view is they have a lot less control over the rate of inflation than they like to think they do, especially with interest rates. It's more about the size of money, the size of the money supply, which of course they've increased massively in recent years, absolutely massively. So it's that's kind of where the inflation is coming from. But yes, look, I think it's more likely the cash rate here, and I can't quite remember what it is at the moment, 4.5 or something, stays where it is for longer.
Yeah, and finally, Adam, before I let you go, do you think that all of this is part of the reason why that State of the Union that was, everybody said, oh, look, he got through it, he made it through the speech. Well, only 33% of voters felt the speech positively impacted their view of the president, so he did not get a bump out of that, and still only 37% of Americans believe he's doing a good job as president. Adam, your take. I mean, the State of the Union couldn't save him. Can anything at this point?
Yeah, well, look, it's certainly a very low bar that that he managed to actually say all the words properly. But that's kind of where we've got to. He did get a big tick for that. But look, I mean, it's a hyper-partisan campaign speech, I thought, and I'm sure that's what most Americans thought too. I mean, they probably wonder, why is this campaign speech given so much attention, kind of in the Congress, when it could have been given anywhere. I mean, as you know, decades ago, the State of the Union speech was meant to be something that kind of reached across the aisle and actually talked about the serious problems the US faced in a bipartisan manner. But it's certainly not the case anymore. I mean, that speech, was just an attack on Republicans and Donald Trump, basically, and surely most Americans saw that. So I'm not surprised at all that he didn't get a bounce in the polls. And look, I mean, I don't think there is anything that can improve his standing. Americans have made up their mind. It's been 3 years. I don't think all the tens of millions, hundreds of millions that are going to be spent on ads are going to make any difference.
Well, we'll see. We've still got a long 8 months to go. Adam Creighton, thanks for your time, as always, on the U.S. Report.
Thanks, James.
Now joining us is your friend and mine, former White House Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at Bondi Partners, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, I want to rip right into this story here that came out this week. Your predecessor at the White House, John Kelly, has sparked some controversy this week after claiming that on a trip with Donald Trump in 2018, that Trump expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler and once said, well, Hitler did a lot of good things. Now, Mick, Donald Trump, what do you reckon? Surely this isn't true. And why do you think, though, that John Kelly would come out with such a bizarre story?
James, it's hard to know where to begin on this one. Let me tell you what I know. I saw that interview on the CNN network here in the U.S. and was just outraged by it. I spent just as much time with Donald Trump as John Kelly, probably more. And I never saw that language, even that inkling that Trump was going there. And for Kelly to say this about the former president of the United States and the future candidate of the United States is simply irresponsible. Why? He hates him. He just does. He's hated him ever since he hated him while he was working for him. In fact, I've often commented I thought John stayed too long because he lost the ability to respect the president of the United States. This is a former chief of staff in this country. This is a pretty big deal. This is a high-ranking position. I've been told it's the rough equivalent of a 4-star general in the military, and John was exactly that. So he should be taking his responsibilities as an ex-chief of staff a lot more seriously. But listen, I criticize Donald Trump from time to time. When I do so, I try to be respectful about it. John Kelly needs to do the same.
Yeah, well, indeed. And I think, we all know in this country as well the power that the chief of staff to a prime minister has as well. It's a very powerful position. But I want to move on to another story this week here, the TikTok story here. Now, remarkable news about the bill to ban TikTok or allow the government to make it not be controlled by the Chinese company ByteDance, I guess, in the U.S. That's passed the House of Representatives. But Donald Trump, he's been opposed to the ban, yet despite that, only 15 Republicans voted against it. Walk us through a bit of the debate here, because I think it might be a little bit more textured than some people are saying that it's just a straight TikTok ban.
Well, it certainly is. And it's always going to be a lot more textured in a country that has such a powerful First Amendment and free speech rights like we have ingrained in our Constitution. But the dynamic here is fascinating to me as just someone who watches politics. Donald Trump actually started the ball rolling against TikTok back in 2018, 2019, and for good reason. He was worried about the Chinese government having access to huge amounts of data on American citizens. He was also worried about the level playing field. So many of our platforms, Twitter, Facebook, are not allowed to operate in China. So Trump was saying, why would we allow theirs to operate here? That's what started this. And of course, the House and the Republicans in the House and many Democrats took it up as well, as you mentioned, and it passed overwhelmingly. Only 15 Republicans voted against it. I think a total of 65 people voted for it. So there were 350 odd people who voted for this thing. You don't find that level of bipartisanship in Washington, D.C. these days. But Trump came out against it just before the vote, and no one can seem to understand why, other than perhaps his visceral hatred of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook Meta. I think that some of this is just personal animosity between the former president and Mr. Zuckerberg, and I think that probably factored in here. You since heard Trump, by the way, slowly sort of refining his position and saying he still believes that TikTok, if it were to be a security threat, should be banned, et cetera. So he's sort of moderating his position on it today.
But Mick, how much of this is a bit of a proxy for a bigger issue? Because it's not just TikTok and their surveillance, but TikTok and their ability to pump propaganda into young people and all sorts of crazy stuff about gender and politics in the Middle East. And I mean, there's a debate that seems to be going on between people who think, as I do, that TikTok and these other tech giants like Meta need to be brought to heel for what often amounts to assaults on our society and our youth and our democracy. But there are those who say that the way this law was written, it would allow the president to say, oh, well, TikTok, it's got too much foreign influence. Maybe we ban that. Who's right here?
Keep in mind, ban it. I don't think it's entirely accurate to call it a ban. It could be, okay, under certain circumstances. But I think the most likely thing is that it ties into what we call CFIUS, which is the investigation we do when any critical U.S. assets are being sold to folks overseas. If an Australian company buys an important American company, then there'd be an investigation as to whether or not it would be in the national interest for America to allow that sale to take place. We have a long history of this. We didn't let the Soviets buy General Motors back in the 1970s if they wanted to. So we've had these type of protections. The typical remedy, James, is that you have the company, say the Chinese company, would have to divest. They'd have to find a buyer for TikTok and sell it to somebody else. And already today, folks, including the former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, have announced that they're trying to put teams together to buy TikTok if it comes to that.
Fascinating. Now, one other thing, though, that I think is really also fascinating is the behavior of the left around Donald Trump. And I love this story because after the Supreme Court rejected attempts to disqualify Trump from the ballot in Colorado, a National Pulse poll has found that 35% of Democrat voters, so a third of them, say that if Trump wins this year's election, they would support Democrats in Congress refusing to certify the election results. Mick, this sounds very kind of, I don't know, almost a little bit insurrection-y to me here.
Yeah.
Who's fighting democracy now?
Yeah, who's undermining democracy is a great question. And this comes back to the first story we talked about with John Kelly, talking about Donald Trump in the same sentence as Hitler. You can't do that. We have to stop doing that in this country. Keep in mind, the Democrats have likened every single Republican candidate or president since Nixon to Hitler in one way or another. Sooner or later, what you get is what you saw in that polling data, which is just a large swath of people saying, you know what, to heck with elections. We don't want to certify him if our person doesn't win. And, why not? If he's Adolf Hitler, maybe they're right about that. So we have to stop doing this. And people who lose need to accept the loss. People who win need to do so graciously. Unfortunately, the country is not moving in that direction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all remember some of the stuff they tried to do to Mitt Romney, who was about the most white bread, bland person, who's ever run for president, but lovely fellow, but nevertheless. Finally, talking about democracies, I want to talk about a democracy overseas, Israel, and the rift between the Biden and Netanyahu governments. And they're at a tipping point here after a U.S. intelligence assessment publicly warned Netanyahu's leadership is in jeopardy. Now, Chuck Schumer has been out speaking against Netanyahu, saying they should basically have another election. This feels a bit like the United States or some Democrats are starting to poke their noses into Israeli Democrat processes and are a bit more concerned about Netanyahu than they are Hamas. Is this about Michigan? What's this about?
Yeah. By the way, yes, it's exactly about Michigan. In other countries, we would call this, election interference, overseas election interference. But I guess it's okay for us to do it if we don't like what the people in the other country are doing. This was a big deal today. The threat assessment was one thing. The Schumer comments on the Senate floor, which I've watched, were some of the most demeaning statements I've seen in the Senate in a long time. He talked to an elected head of state, one of our close allies, like a small child. And not in a good kind of way. So it's really surprising how quickly the Democrats are starting to flip on Israel. Yes, it comes back to Michigan. They all saw that vote tally during the Michigan primary a couple of weeks back where more than 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the Democrat primary to send a message to Joe Biden that they did like his policies in Gaza. And Donald Trump won Michigan by less than 40,000 votes back in 2016. So 100,000 is a big deal in Michigan. The answer to your question, James, is yes. This is politics. It's a shame the Democrats don't have any statesmen like they were calling for back when Donald Trump was president.
Mick, it's an absolute mess. Thank you so much for your time, and we will speak to you next week, I am sure. Now, before we go to the break, we're going to have Batya Ungar-Sargon with us on why you're not wrong. The left really does hate normal people, as if you didn't need any more evidence when you see things like this. Ilhan Omar, one of the chief members of the squad, assuring us that everything is absolutely A-OK with Joe Biden.
Did he lay any concerns that you may have had about his age or his ability to do the job?
I was never really concerned with that. I've spent time with the president, both in the White House, traveled back with him to my district, spent time with him in the district. It always seemed very clear to me that he had the energy and the ability to continue to do this work.
That's right. Don't believe your own eyes. There's no higher authority on this than the Congresswoman from Mogadishu. Batya Ungar-Sargon in a tick. Welcome back to the program. In a moment, I'll be joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon, who will walk us through the woke Oscars and why it's true, yeah, they really do hate you. But first, meet Jason Beck. He's an associate director in the office of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon. In his job, he helps craft defense policy that will be sent over to the White House. Oh, and he's also been exposed by undercover reporter James O'Keefe as a radical leftist who doesn't believe in borders. Yeah, I know. The guy works in an office to defending the nation, but he doesn't even believe that nation needs defending. Have a listen to this.
You know, just lots of that talk about, like, border security. Border security, what does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's just, like, throwing money in people at a problem that doesn't really exist. When has a terrorist ever come in?
I would like to do some work on the state's monopoly on violence.
State's monopoly? What is that?
It's the idea that the state, meaning the country, is the only sort of legitimate purveyor of violence and force of force. We're the only ones with guns, right? I think we should repeal it. And take them all away. Whatever, just take them all.
So what would be like a federal solution?
But I wonder if you would see a similar solution to like school integration.
Yeah.
You know, where they did have to mobilize the National Guard. How many people in the National Guard, maybe were personally opposed to integration, but still followed orders and made it happen?
Hopefully they would have to follow the orders.
Right.
I don't know how that's going to happen.
We need to pack the court.
You have all the power to solve the world issues.
Court reform, you need to get a majority on the court so that they can stop the legislation.
Universal health care, we could start there. Abolishing the Senate. Gosh, there's so many things that you could do.
Border security. Love the scare quotes there. So our friend doesn't believe terrorists will sneak in over the border. Yeah, right, there's tons of evidence they already are. And he also thinks that the National Guard should be turned against American citizens, that the Senate should be abolished, and that the Supreme Court should be packed so that it is just a rubber stamp for the woke progressive left agenda. Now, there's a lot more that O'Keefe uncovered, but you get the idea. These are boiled down progressive elite attitudes, not just in action, but in power. And it's pretty scary stuff. Now let's bring in Batya Ungar-Sargon, opinion editor of Newsweek and author of a new book, Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. Batya, thank you so much for coming on the U.S. Report this evening. Now, before we go into politics, I think we've got to talk a little bit about pop culture and some really disturbing displays at the Oscars this year. First, we had Jewish director Jonathan Glazer use his acceptance speech to essentially renounce his Judaism.
Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people.
Then we had celebrities, including Billie Eilish, Mark Ruffalo, and many other stars wearing a pin, a lapel pin, featuring bloody hands. And I suppose they meant to say that the Israelis had blood on their hands, but to Israelis, this calls out the murder of two of their lot in 2000, who were kidnapped and murdered and their bodies paraded through the streets by Palestinians. And there was a famous photo you just saw of one of the killers proudly showing his bloody hands to a cheering crowd. Batya, is anti-Semitism now institutionalized in Hollywood, of all places?
You know, I have to say, James, there was a lot less sort of ceasefire, pro-Palestinian energy than I was expecting. There were really only a handful of stars wearing those pins. I know that to Israelis it evokes that imagery, but I can tell you Mark Ruffalo is not wearing a pin because he's thinking about that horrible, horrible moment. He's wearing it because he's a very nice person with very stupid politics. And, you know, this call for a ceasefire, right? I don't agree with it. I think it's wrong. I think it's bad for Israel. I think it's bad for America. But it is not inherently anti-Semitic. Now, the speech that Glazer gave, on the other hand, I want you to understand why so many Jews were so horrified by what he said. He said that he refutes his Jewishness and the Holocaust being used to justify the occupation. First of all, who is doing that? Nobody is out there saying because there was a Holocaust, therefore Israel can mistreat Palestinians. No one says that. So what he did was he invented a bad Jew to say, I'm not that. I am a good Jew. What he does is he is addressing the anti-Semites. He is giving succor and comfort to the anti-Semites, saying there are all these bad Jews out there. You're right. And I am the good Jew. What a disgusting thing to do after winning an award for a Holocaust movie.
Now, Batya, that's absolutely, yeah, I think that's absolutely cuts to the core of the matter. But I want to move then now on to the sort of bigger political scene in the U.S. And it seems like American politics is starting to realign in ways that you have predicted and talked about in your work. And we're in the midst of a racial realignment, with recent polling showing non-white voters shifting away from Democrats towards Republicans, and an economic realignment as well, with the richest now explicitly favoring Democrats over Republicans. Walk us through these numbers here and how this plays out into this idea that the Democrats have basically abandoned their working class roots.
Yes, thank you so much for pointing out that I've been right all along, James. One never tires of hearing such a thing. But yes, indeed, the people who have been talking about the realignment for all of these years, it turns out we knew what we were talking about. 9 of the 10 richest districts in America are now led by Democrats. 65% of people making more than $500,000 a year are now Democrats. 97% of donations from Silicon Valley go to Democrats, as well as 94% of donations from journalists. Did you know, James, that Wall Street in 2020 gave more money to Democrats than they did to Donald Trump? That's what we're seeing here, is a realignment. And, you know, they love to say white rural rage is what's fueling Donald Trump. It is a canard. It is nonsense. Joe Biden is losing Black and Hispanic working class Americans who are not defecting for the GOP. They are defecting for Donald Trump because he speaks to the working class of all races. And the Democrats, meanwhile, have abandoned labor to cater to highly educated college elites and the dependent poor on the bottom, people who don't work, meaning everybody else who is working class, who works with their hands for a living, who struggles for the American dream, the Democrats have turned their backs on them. And it's worse than that, James. With every utterance, with every bill, with every policy, they express their disdain for these people, not just the white working class, but increasingly working class of people of color.
Well, and, you know, just on the subject of going after the working class, this story here is a great microcosm of that. New York Attorney General Letitia James was famously booed at a New York firefighters ceremony last week, and there were reports that they were going to have a full investigation to find and punish those who booed Letitia James. She's a woman who's been going against Donald Trump in New York. Now, after publicity the spokesman for the fire department said, no, we're not going to investigate. It's all fine. But just the fact that, you know, firefighters are booing a Democrat and that the Democrat regime is going after firefighters, and you don't get more sort of, you know, peak of the honest working class than that, that's pretty telling, isn't it?
That's exactly right. This entire lawfare project against Donald Trump, which has been waged by elite Democrats with multiple degrees, right? The quintessential over-credentialed college elites stand in direct contrast to people like firefighters who have achieved the American dream through hard work, through skilled trades, through manufacturing, right? These are used to be de rigueur, regular ways for average working class Americans to achieve the American dream. They're increasingly vanishing, but the areas where they remain, cops, firefighters, these are people that the Democrats can't stand because they have managed to achieve the American dream while circumventing the woke doctrination of a college degree, which is the only way that Democrats want you to be able to have an American dream. So that scene of them yelling, Trump, 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 right? That scene is you're exactly right, James. That is the realignment in one image.
And, you know, you spoke a moment ago about how just there's basically no policy that they won't do to go after ordinary people. This story made me so mad as a New Yorker because New York City is now going after pizza, and Mayor Eric Adams' environmental department has approved a plan that requires pizzerias with, you know, wood and coal fire ovens to cut their pollutants by 75%. Batya, is there any pleasure that normal people can take and enjoy that the elite will not go after?
By the way, it's not just pizza ovens, it's matzah ovens. I'm an Orthodox Jew, right? We need to make matzah for Passover. What are we supposed to do? Yes, you nailed it again, James. The Green New Deal is class warfare against the working class. It's always the working class who are asked to make sacrifices on the altar of the elite woke vanity.
Batya Ungar-Sargon, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for breaking it down for us, and we'll have you on again soon on the U.S. Report. Now, we said at the top of the show that inflation was going to be a big deal. Let's get the Ragin' Cajun Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana's take.
I can't say that I'm surprised, Steve. Look, President Biden is an inflation machine. My people in Louisiana, median household income $55,000 a year. Yep. President Biden's inflation is costing them an extra $10,000 a year, and they don't have it. No kidding. This was predictable. You can't print, borrow, and spend the kind of money that President Biden has without causing inflation. Some days I think the Biden White House would lower the average IQ of an entire city.
George Papadopoulos is next. Back before you know it. Welcome back to the program. Joining us now is Donald Trump's former campaign advisor, George Papadopoulos, and author of Deep State Target, How I Got Caught in the Crosshairs of the Plot to Bring Down President Trump. He's the man who had the infamous wine bar chat in London with Alexander Downer that some say led to the Russia hoax investigation against Donald Trump for being a supposed agent of Moscow. George Papadopoulos joins me now on the U.S. Report. George, thanks for coming on this evening. Now, Donald Trump is officially the presumptive Republican presidential nominee at this point, and the stage is set for a Biden v. Trump rematch in November. No surprises, but now that he is the nominee, I want to ask you, with your experience with this sort of thing, do you expect that behind the scenes there will be forces again trying to stop his path to victory?
Well, James, thanks so much for having me. And what I really think we're witnessing, not only in the United States, but around the world, is the greatest political comeback in history. And there are, no matter what political forces might be at bay, I don't think that they could really stop the MAGA movement and its vast reverberations throughout the United States. We can't forget that over 75 million Americans voted for President Trump. And the reason that I believe that he did secure the nomination the way that he did is because he's running on charisma, ideas, and he's forward-looking instead of this dark, pessimistic, and almost violent approach that Biden has towards over 75 million Americans in the world, in the United States. So you could really understand how diametrically opposed Trump and Biden are today regarding both the description and their vision for the United States moving forward, especially this election. So I don't think there's anything that could stop President Trump from winning this election, because the people want him to win. His approval is soaring. He's raising robust sums of money, and people see right through these various maneuvers that both the Democrats and even some in the Republican Party are committing against him.
So do you think that he is, I guess you could say, not unstoppable, but unswampable?
Well, I think that's absolutely why he is having the type of impact this election the same way that he did in 2016. Because let's look at the facts. The factors that he's once again facing are so similar to 2016 when I was on his campaign. He's facing overt lawfare, except in 2016 it was more subtle. And he was facing these establishment swamp-like candidates in the Republican Party that had unsummable, that had incredible amount of money from super PACs and various other donors. And it once again highlighted that no amount of money can really stop a candidate as long as that candidate has the support and the will of the people. So I really do think that if you want an unswampable candidate, Donald Trump was your man in 2016, 2020, and in this election, certainly.
And George, I want to get your reaction to the reports that came out a couple of weeks ago that revealed that the CIA and foreign intelligence agencies did, in fact, illegally target 26 associates of Donald Trump before the 2016 Russia collusion claims. What was your reaction when you saw that news, and did you feel like there was some vindication for your story?
Well, I felt initially that it was a profound and devastating indictment for not only the U.S. intel agencies, but of course, allied intelligence. And this is something that I've been speaking about since probably 2018, when many people thought this was some sort of rogue FBI operation. I always said that, of course, there was international intrigue behind this story. And also, I think that it's total and absolute vindication, not only for myself at a personal level, but of course, the Trump campaign and President Trump. And I think it's going to have new deleterious consequences should President Trump get reelected for certain bilateral relationships.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we'll see how that plays out. But also, I just want to ask you about this, too, because FBI Director Chris Wray was grilled at a congressional hearing this week. He refused to confirm whether or not he was aware that, in fact, an audio recording existed of Joe Biden discussing classified documents. Have a listen to this.
Are you aware that there's an audio recording of Joe Biden saying to his ghostwriter in February of 2016, quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote? Are you aware of that audio recording?
Again, I would just respectfully refer you to the special counsel.
No, I'm asking you, are you aware as director of the FBI? You're either aware or you're not.
I'm aware. Am I aware of what now?
Whether the audio exists of Joe Biden saying in February 2017, quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote, to his ghostwriter.
Again, I'm just going to refer to the special counsel and his testimony and his report.
It sounds like you might be aware of it then.
George, your reaction to another one of these so-called letter agencies essentially trying to cover for Joe Biden and for the Democrats?
I think that there's nothing more corrosive or dangerous to our way of life and our functioning as a republic than a two-tier justice system. And what you just witnessed was Exhibit A of a two-tier justice system, in which there's now a profound perception among a wide segment of the American population which believes that the FBI is essentially covering up for various crimes committed not only by the Biden family, President Biden, and even high-profile Democrats, while on the other hand, you have the Department of Justice debasing itself from historic norms to then go out and indict a former president, raid his home, and put him through these various kangaroo court situations while he's leading in the polls in the middle of an election. So it's no surprise. Unfortunately, conservatives in America have been dealing with this type of weaponization of justice. It's certainly something that moving forward, Donald Trump is going to certainly have to address, especially regarding his cabinet picks. And that's why I think his attorney general, who he's considering for FBI director, CIA director, are probably more important than his vice president at this point.
George Papadopoulos, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this evening on the U.S. Report. Now, we'll be back in a moment with Only in America. But first, you want to see the next 8 months of the Trump campaign boiled down into 45 seconds? I knew you did. Here's the man himself laying down the lines he hoped will win him the presidency again.
They see how bad, how pathetic Biden's been. He's the worst president in the history of our country. He's corrupt. He's incompetent. He's weaponized the justice system to go after his political opponent, which has never been done before. And he's the worst president we've ever had. He's not respected at all in foreign. Look, you wouldn't have Russia attacking Ukraine. You wouldn't have Israel being attacked. Iran was broke when I was president. They were broke because of me. Let's say they were broke. And they didn't have the money to give to Hamas or Hezbollah. All of these things, you wouldn't have inflation because it was caused by energy. All of these things were things that were very preventable, not preventable by him. And the problem we have 7 months to go, a little more than 7 months to go. That's an eternity when you have incompetent people running the government.
Only in America is next. Welcome back to the program. And now it's time for, yeah, you knew this was coming. That's right. Let's do it. A little bit of Only in America. Well, have you ever met a non-binary alpaca? I hadn't either, till now. But happily, even if our generation has missed out on such delights, there is hope for the kids of today to meet such wonders. I'm kidding, of course. This is lunacy, and this is what is being taught in America's schools. Have a look at this actual Year 5 teacher explaining what he's teaching instead of, I don't know, biology or the U.S. Constitution or whatever.
Let me introduce you to our non-binary alpaca. The kids voted on a gender-neutral name, Alex, for them. Alex was there to help me during the really quiet moments when nobody would talk during virtual learning. Yes, they were so quiet! But then I also took it as an opportunity to teach my students about how to respect people's pronouns. Did Alex ever get misgendered? Yes. But then it opened up some teachable moments about what to do when that would happen. For example, hey, Mr. Vuong, did he just wake up from his nap? Oh, do you mean did they wake up from their nap? Yeah, they just did. I would apologize quickly, make the correction, and move on. I started off modeling how to correct somebody, and then afterwards my students would correct each other whenever somebody would misgender Alex here. Representation in the classroom matters. My kids were 5th graders, and they still got a kick out of Alex. Oh yes, and here's Alex's friend, Lincoln the Llama, who goes by pronouns he, him. At first, my students thought that he had very feminine features, so they thought that he was a girl. And this is why we should never assume somebody's gender just based on what they look like. Alright, Lincoln, say something. Hello. My students were really surprised how low his voice sounded.
Yep, this sort of stuff is going to keep America a superpower for decades to come. The kids who also mastered the gender-neutral llama as well as the alpaca, well, they're off to Harvard. All right, anyway, time to hoof it. Get it? Hoofs? Llamas? Terrible joke. Until next time, if you misgender an alpaca and it takes offense, don't freak out. Just turn it into a sweater. Bye-bye.